Welcome again to Sound Meets Sound. Welcome, Sakari, Dixon, to the Sound Meets Sound podcast. Thank you very much for joining me. And can you just give me a short description of who you are and what it is you do?
Yeah, my name is Sakari Dixon, and I'm a violist and composer out in Redlands, California. Like many musicians, I have my time split between like teaching, performing, and composing. Mm-hmm. And so I do a lot of each throughout the week. I'm currently working on a couple of pieces, one for viola and piano and another for orchestra. I'm performing in different orchestras around here, such as the Redlands Community Orchestra and the Redlands Symphony as well. And then I also teach out I teach independently and out in San Jacinto with an El Sistema group. So it's pretty fun.
That's cool. That sounds like every musician I've talked to on this podcast. You're doing like a million things, it's just the life of a musician. I was reading online your bio, and it said you started composing in middle school. Is that right?
That is correct. I think the very first time I was introduced into composition was in 5th grade, just a little assignment, put a whole note here, half note there, really random.
Right.
But when it really started to take off was in middle school. We had this project where we would team up with the visual art students. Mm-hmm. And we got into little groups of, I think, 3 or 4. And what we did was we, came up with a theme of some sort, and then we worked on a painting together and then wrote a piece to go with it. And then after realizing that there was, music software in our library at school, I started continuing to play around with it in the after-school program when I had free time. And so I was writing duets for friends and things like that. So.
Oh, cool. Do you remember what the software was?
It was Finale Allegro.
Oh, okay, all right. So that's really cool. Is your process a lot different? Obviously, it probably is than when you were in middle school. I'm just, trying to get to the question of like, what is your compositional process? How does it start? Do you work directly into a program, or do you make notes first?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I do still attach my composition either to like an image in my mind or at least like a vague narrative. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say a lot of my music is programmatic in the sense that like, oh, this happens here, there, but right. I do tend to have, somewhat of a picture in my mind, which is funny because I haven't really done much like drawing or painting since I was little. And I'd be embarrassed to draw anything now, but a lot of it does kind of have something, visual attached to it or a feeling or things like that. I normally start writing on paper, actually. I find that it's less distracting, and I tend to do a lot of like scribbling and like, oh, here's a little bit of this section and a little bit of that. Mm-hmm. So it's actually a real nuisance to start putting things in right away.
Right.
And then I also find that, especially like working on a laptop, you have this like small screen. Mm-hmm. It does kind of skew your perceptions of phrase length and things like that. So I try to stay away from it early on. Mm-hmm. I also I like to do a little bit of improvising, things like that. Maybe find a melody, put this in somewhere, and then work off of that. I guess what I think is pretty odd, I don't know, maybe it's really normal. A lot of times I'll come up with a melody, a little idea, and then, especially if that piece isn't for some kind of like deadline or something, it just kind of sits there. Mm-hmm. And then I'll get distracted with something else. Uh-huh. And then when I actually need it, it's like, oh yeah, I wrote this one, violin melody a while back. Maybe I'll go dig that up and then like work from there. I guess it's a little less daunting than dealing with a purely blank page.
Right. So, it's like little gifts you're giving to your future self.
I guess. That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Blank page or the blank score is, really intimidating. And sometimes all you have in a moment is that little germ, that little melody. Yeah. So, or seed or whatever. And then, sometimes you don't want to force it into anything. You want to let it sit for a while. And then once you once you have sort of the ideas that you're doing, and you've sort of done a sketch, I guess is the idea. How do you go about really fleshing that out into like a final piece? Like, what are you thinking about, like, in terms of structure? Because that's, for me, I write like little electronic pieces, and the hardest part for me is structuring it. Is it something that just happens organically, or do you really think about, okay, this will happen here and this will happen here?
I would say maybe it's about 50-50. I definitely struggle with structure as well. If you see a lot of my like paper sketches, it's like, oh, this is going to go somewhere in the middle of the piece, and that maybe towards the end.
Right.
I often don't have an idea until things start to get filled out a little bit more, and then it's like a jigsaw puzzle. It's like, oh, this makes more sense here.
Right.
It's funny. I was working on something the other day in my viola and piano piece, and I thought it would be like closer to the beginning. And once I started developing it out, I was like, no, this. It's not really developing. It's more calmed down. It needs to go like towards the end. So it's definitely all over the place.
How is it that you think about development? Is it that one line happens and then the way the next instrument or line layers with that kind of determines the next thing? Or is it more all at once, a texture at once? Is that making any sense at all?
Yeah, it's making sense. I do tend to think, I guess, in like a linear or layered fashion, especially I have a piece, a Feral, for saxophone and string trio, and that was definitely a lot of the, like when I was writing it, a lot of the saxophone came first, and then the strings were, kind of commenting on everything in a way.
Right.
And then there were some parts where it's like, okay, the viola has a melody, it's taking over, and then I get to write the context around that. So yeah, I guess it's more of a linear fashion in that sense.
Yeah, that's what I was noticing when I was re-listening through the pieces, and especially Feral. It's easy because you have YouTube with the score, so you can really see how the lines are putting together. I want to ask about these two pieces you mentioned, the orchestra and the viola and piano. So with the viola and piano, viola, I can see that's your primary instrument. And I assume it's probably relatively natural to write for you, or maybe it's not. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I'm also curious about how you write for piano as a single line instrumentalist. How do you approach writing for piano?
Yeah, it's funny that you said viola would come naturally, because it does. In my lessons, one of the things Rena, the lady that I study with, pointed out is that I often start writing melodies in alto clef, which is also interesting because I actually started on violin, so it's not like I can't, read treble or even bass or things like that. It's just I often tend to think of melodies from that mid-voice range, that kind of speaking voice, register. Yeah, piano, it's definitely been a little bit more of a challenge for me because I haven't written as much for piano. And I'm finding that it definitely is forcing me to think more texturally instead of, of course you can do melody with piano, but that's not really, you're missing out on so much, if you just approach it from that standpoint.
So you kind of answered one of the questions I was going to ask, which was, how does being a violist influence the way that you compose, and you were saying like the mid-voice range. The viola also has, to my ear, a very unique timbre, even separate from the other string instruments. The viola just has this really unique timbre that's, it's kind of like a speaking voice. It's a little... I can't think of I need to get, Megan Lavengood wrote a dissertation on timbre, and I really need to read it because I don't have the words for this. But I have it to read, but I just haven't read it yet. But it's kind of a rich but grainy texture to me.
Yeah, that's true.
You had mentioned texture in the piano. So, how do you think about texture? How do you think about it, and then how do you get that onto the page?
Yeah, I definitely, I like to kind of play with, it's funny because, you start talking about timbre and all the words, it's like you're describing the thing, but you're not really describing the thing. I actually, what I'll do sometimes is I'll just simply, along with this sketches of the piece, so I'll have, like a melody or, just some notes. Mm-hmm. I'll start writing things in like, glassy or sparkly or things like that, and then find, techniques or register or things like that to fit with it. Right. So I guess I work backwards from, I was going to say like plain English, but it's not really plain, like more like poetic terms, and then find something to communicate that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. Yeah, you can, it's funny if you say glassy sound, you can kind of hear that, like it's enough to say that it wants sparkly or glassy or rumbly or whatever. Yeah. So then the orchestra piece, talk about timbre, like, how are you approaching, again, there's the question of structure, but then instrumentation. I mean, are you going to use are you writing for a full orchestra here, or is it more of a chamber orchestra or modified orchestra,
Yeah, this one's for a full orchestra.
Okay.
Including harp. There's a lot of that in there, which is fun. It's another one of those pieces that started out with like, I wrote, I don't know, I think it was originally for violin. I wrote like a melody and then just left it in a notebook somewhere, and then decided, I wanted to work on this piece. And it's funny, that melody is actually, I'm trying to think of one time it's actually played plainly in the violin at this point, because it's like, oh no, I want to move it around to this instrument, or split it up between, a bunch of different ones. Yeah, working with an orchestra, it's interesting because there's so much available in that palette.
Right.
But you can't just throw everything in there. So I'm definitely having to think a little bit more about not just, what's practical, because I want it to be at a level like a good community orchestra could play it. So yeah, I'm thinking not only about what's practical, but what are the strengths of different instruments and things like that. What combinations of instruments maybe playing the same line can actually create new colors.
Right.
So it's been kind of a fun experiment.
Yeah. Are you pretty good at like hearing these things in your head, or do you use like a notation program or a digital audio workstation to like plug these things in and kind of test?
Yeah, for the most part, I kind of do my best to try to hear it in my head. Mm-hmm. I find that, especially in a piece like this where timbre is so central, I have a lot of it in Sibelius right now, but when I'm creating material, I try to stay away from it, because you start to hear squeaky sounding instruments. It just, it's not, it skews your perception of what it's actually going to sound like. Right. And so it's hard to trust it. Well, I find, especially because I still perform pretty actively, and probably the majority of the performance stuff that I do is in orchestra, I try to do my best, like even when I'm in rehearsal, to, like if there's a moment that I like,
right.
Like, like how is this being put together here? Or a similar thing, even when I just go and watch other concerts, I try to like really lean in and see like, oh, they have this going at the same time as that.
I always wish I had learned a string instrument, because you're in the orchestra, like you kind of have a leg up as a composer. As a violist in orchestras, do you play mostly like canon repertoire, or are the groups that you play in playing like contemporary music as well?
Yeah, I do play a lot of repertoire in the canon, but one of the reasons that I joined the Redlands Community Orchestra, besides the fact that it's like super local and convenient, is the fact that I initially heard that they were having like a call for scores, and they've been doing this every other year or so. They started it, even before I joined, and they draw from pieces from local composers. Oh, okay. So people going to universities or like living in the area, things like that. And so it's nice to, get to meet people who are composers who are here. Right. It's funny because there are actually a good handful of composers in the group, which is nice. Yeah. And the conductor is also good about choosing programs that are, there's something like really canonical, like, Beethoven 5 or something like it. Everybody knows that. Yeah. But then he'll also choose something that's like slightly off the beaten path, that, is probably a great piece for the audience to know, and also for the musicians to learn. So it's been nice to have that mix as well. I find it gives a lot of variety. Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't know where Redlands was until I looked it up for this.
That's okay. That's most people.
I've heard the name. So it sounds like I was going to ask about what kind of community you have around you in Redlands, if you feel like you're hooked into an artistic scene or community, or do you spend a lot of time hooking into other cities' scenes like Chicago, New York, Baltimore, that kind of thing. Just a lot of, I think every podcast I've done so far, we've talked a lot about community because it's really hard to exist alone as a musician.
That is true.
I don't know, do you feel like you're part of a community in Redlands?
I do. Yeah, it's funny because it's like a relatively small town. Yeah. I guess to say, like, compared to like San Bernardino or Riverside or like other places nearby. It's a town where there's like a lot of like tradition and people who have, been here for generations, and so there's a lot of that kind of like small town spirit in a way, which is interesting because like driving through, it's not that small, but it feels small. Like you go to Trader Joe's and run into like 3 people, that kind of thing. Right. But yeah, I would say that the music community here is pretty strong. There's the Redlands Community Orchestra, and a lot of people there are pretty, tight-knit as friends. Mm-hmm. There's also another small chamber orchestra that I perform with called Musica Viva. And it's a small chamber orchestra and actually like a chamber choir as well. Oh. And so we get together and do concerts. There's also the Spinnet Club, which I'm a part of. Mm-hmm. And it's, I'm trying to remember how old, it's over 100 years old, this organization. Oh. Basically, like once a month we'll meet, someone will host maybe at their house or a church, or, if they have access to some other, facility. They'll host like these little recitals. Oh. And it's nice because there's a built-in audience, and we'll usually have like a reception or a potluck or things like that. Yeah, I'm definitely finding that I feel like the music community is a little bit more hidden compared to, say, like going to LA, you just kind of see, performances and whatnot everywhere. Right. But it's there, and everyone kind of knows everyone, so it's really fun.
When you finish the viola and piano piece, like, do you have performers in mind, or is that something that will come later?
Yeah, so that piece is actually going to be performed, I'm going to perform it with a pianist in the Spinnet Club in January. Oh, cool. So it's coming soon.
Oh, nice. It's always nice to have a built-in performance.
Yeah.
Yeah, January. Oh my gosh, it's so soon.
Yeah, I know.
Well, that's cool. And you'll perform the viola part.
Mm-hmm.
I see. Okay. And then do you have plans for recording, or are you more in a like writing phase and you'll think about recording later? Or?
Yeah, I'm a little bit more in the writing phase right now, but I definitely want to record it because it's just nice to have good recordings of everything.
I know. I guess I'm a little curious about your teaching. Is the teaching a big part of your, musical life, or is that just something you're doing to, not necessarily just for the money, but that's just something you're doing because you need to, have these other activities going on, or is teaching something you're really passionate about, or like, how do you approach that?
It does help that teaching is like relatively like really consistent financially, so that's nice. But I actually really do like teaching. I teach, I don't remember if I mentioned, but I teach both viola and violin. Okay. And I have a handful of individual students and some students in the after-school El Sistema program. And I find that it's really enlightening and refreshing to see really young people especially approach like learning an instrument with new eyes and ears, because it's almost easy to forget, like, even though I didn't start that young, I started around like 9 or so. Mm-hmm. Like, it's easy to forget, being in that season of your life.
Right, yeah.
Where, it's like, oh, why don't I hold the bow this way? This feels more comfortable. Hey,
Right. Yeah, I've always heard, and it was my experience too, like as a teacher, you learn from your students. Well, yeah, so that was what I was forgetting. I wanted to ask you, so what is your experience with El Sistema? What is it? I don't really even know what it's about. Do you mind talking a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can share a little bit. I'm actually fairly new to working in it, so I'll do my best. I started working with the program actually over the summer. Mm-hmm. They had like a 1-month summer strings academy that was held in a local like art center in Hemet. So that was kind of nice. So at least in this program, the kids come to the class 2 to 3 times a week, depending on their level. Mm-hmm. And like before they can even get their instruments, they'll, like make cardboard instruments, and they learn a little bit about music theory as well, which is nice because I'm really into having that well-rounded.
Yes.
Kind of learning and not just like, okay, here's how to put your finger there.
Right.
There's a strong communal aspect as well, mm-hmm. because they involve the parents really early, and the parents are volunteering and helping out with things. And so, yeah, I think that's what I find most notable about the program is that communal, mm-hmm. that strong communal aspect. Right. And there's someone to support them all the way through.
I don't know if you had this, but when I from ages 10 until college, I always felt kind of less than, like, I didn't start early enough. And then when I got to college, I really started to feel like, most of the people that were around me have been playing since they were like in the womb, So it was like very daunting. I mean, did you feel like you were behind, or was your experience different with that, especially when you got to college,
Yeah, I would say it's probably very similar, actually. Mm-hmm. I started learning in, public schools. And at that point, I wasn't very, self-conscious of it, because everyone that I knew that was playing violin or cello or whatever was in the same kind of program. It started to occur to me that, maybe I was a little bit behind the pack, so to speak, when I was doing, honor orchestras and things like that.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Or other, local competitions, and realizing, some of these kids have had private lessons since they were, 2,
Yes. I know. Your degree is in composition, right? Or is it in...
Yes.
Okay.
It's in composition.
Okay. So did you start college thinking, I'm going to be a composer, or did you start as a violist and then decide to move to composition?
Yeah, I actually, when I auditioned, it was for composition. At the University of Redlands, they're pretty adamant about having their composers still be performers, which I wanted to do anyway.
Yeah.
I still auditioned on viola, and I was still in orchestra and all the other things. I did recital on viola as well. I think originally I wasn't sure if I was just going to do composition or if I was going to do a double major. But I decided that would just be too overwhelming, because I was also doing a Spanish minor, and I'm can only juggle so much. So yeah, I did composition, and I just made sure I took lessons and did a lot of the performance stuff along the way still.
Mm-hmm. So did you do a lot of that in college, working with a specific player and developing a piece with an instrumentalist, or have you done much of that? Or
yeah, I actually trying to think, probably most of my pieces were like that in college. For example, the piece Feral for alto saxophone and string trio. Let's see, when did I start writing it? I think I started writing it at the beginning of my senior year. Mm-hmm. And I had literally put up a poster in August, in the music department hallway. Mm-hmm. And I was like, basically who who wants a piece and is willing to perform it?
Nice.
It's this little silly wander poster, yeah.
Oh, I like that. Just a poster, hey.
Yes.
Who wants me to write for them? Yeah.
And then, and my friend Kelsey approached me, mm-hmm. and she wanted a piece. We originally were thinking of doing a saxophone concerto, but it wasn't going to be done in time for there was a concerto competition, but it was that November or so.
Oh, yeah.
And so pretty soon we realized we're that's really, really soon. So let's do it for, the spring. Mm-hmm. And we can do a chamber ensemble or something. Mm-hmm. And so at that point I realized, well, I still kind of want that saxophone in string sound. And so I just reduced it it was actually originally a string quartet. And then I was like, I don't need 2 violins. So I just even reduced it from there.
Right.
Yeah. So it was fun, writing little sketches and taking it to her to see what it sounded like, or mm-hmm. having her, play, melody and growl, along with it, or things like that. I also have another piece It's for bass, flute, and percussion. And that one was commissioned by another student, the bassist. He came to me and, wanted a chamber piece, and so I got to work with him on that. So.
Oh, right. Is that oak? Or I'm trying to remember which one.
It's Bailando en la sombra de locura. Right. Dancing in the shadows of madness.
Oh, okay.
That one.
It was like, I know a little Spanish, but I know it's dancing.
That's okay. Yeah, that's okay.
Right, Bailando. That's right. Yeah, I listened to that piece. Well, it's interesting you said that about Farrell, because when I was listening to it, it's interesting you say it started as a concerto, because I was like, this is a really good showpiece for an alto saxophonist. Like, it's a good, really shows the range of the player, and obviously she was really good, So,
yeah, that was fun too.
It had that concerto vibe, and even kind of like a little mini cadenza type thing. Yeah. So and Bailando I really liked. I liked the textures in that piece. When you're writing for bass, it's like kind of like also writing for classical guitar, because they're not very loud instruments.
No.
So that sets a lot of not necessarily in a negative way, but that sets limitations on what you can do if you're trying to showcase the bass, or it's a bassist piece. Yeah,
I guess it's just not as boomy as like people expect.
Right.
Right. That's the problem.
Yeah, because in the orchestra there's like, 5, 6, 7 of them. And, that's why they sound strong. So. Yeah, those are interesting challenges to take on as a composer, from my perspective anyway, is writing for alto sax and bass, because those aren't really like the standard solo instruments.
That's true. Yeah. Now that I think about it, that is true.
Those are interesting challenges to take on. You're going to forget the details now. You did something about, in reaction to a new Music Box article about ageism in the classical world, there was something about writing for composers over 40 years old.
Oh, yeah. It was a call for scores for composers over 40.
For you.
Yeah, the article, I think it was simply titled Ageism in New Music. And I read it, and I had kind of heard of the topic before, but I hadn't really thought about it that deeply, I guess. So I kind of was almost like really impulsive. I was like, I'm just going to put up a blog post and just say, hey, let's do this.
That's great.
It was pretty impulsive.
Well, I mean, those impulsive things, like, you have the impulse for a reason, like it's, as a developed musician, like, you have instincts, so why not trust them? So it was a call for scores for you as a violist to play music for composers over 40, I see. And then I think you said you got a lot of submissions and you chose 3 of them.
I only opened the call for about 3 weeks, because I actually wanted to take the time to go through what I would get.
Yes.
And I was mainly, I also did a short call because I really wanted to perform stuff that like people had already written, know? And some things were written, really recently, or I guess some person, wrote them in that time. But a lot of them were, pieces that were completed previously. And I think it was over 90 pieces, which really shocked me. And I did listen through them.
You would
know. So I picked 3 pieces from there. And I'm actually still in the progress of, working to put that on, as a recital or something. At the time that I did that call for scores, I was, working full-time in an office job and still doing, teaching lessons and whatnot. Honestly, most of my practicing was like, okay, here's this orchestra concert coming up, a lot more short-sighted stuff. And so my work schedule didn't change up until around this spring or so. So I'm finally starting to get back into, composing more, and then working on side projects and trying to start some chamber music things. So that'll be nice. It's still on my music stand. Yeah.
It's still there.
Yes.
If you're all listening, it's still there.
Yes. Haven't forgotten.
Yeah, that time management thing has come up a lot too in this podcast about balancing things, teaching and the need to pay bills, and but then also, really nourishing, giving the time to your what it is you actually want to do with your life, So what are your kind of long-term goals as a musician, composer, violist? Like, where, what is on the distant horizon, or what would you like to be on the distant horizon?
I definitely see myself doing music full-time at some point, whether that's, teaching, performing. I'm very comfortable with the idea of having like a mixture of multiple things. Right. It's actually gotten to the point where, like, even if I could find like one job that paid all the bills, and like even if it was the music, if it's just one thing, I think I'd get really bored. That's kind of scary to me.
I know.
Yeah.
Totally.
So I definitely see myself, doing that full time. I really like chamber music and new music, and I hope to be able to work with ensembles and collectives to kind of get that going on a more regular basis. It's kind of, I guess, my dream at some point to like have maybe a teaching program where kids not only, learn to perform and, learn to read music, things like that, but also we're very, very active in composition, because kids are so open-minded. They're not afraid to make weird sounds. And they really, like, even some of the kids that I've taught in private lessons, like sometimes they'll bring me music for an audition or something, and then, it's a middle school piece, but maybe it has a random 5/4 bar or something. Like, I have seen adults that are like, why is this here? Right. And then kids are like, oh wait, how do I play this? Oh, that sounds cool. They're just so flexible. I think getting really young people to compose is like really underestimated. So I hope to be able to give that back.
Thank you, Sakari Dixon, for being on Sound Meets Sound, and really looking forward to what comes next with you.
Thank you for having me on the show.